We'll get to the main event now. I'm super excited to welcome you all to the Writer Center's virtual craft chat series, where we talk with writers a little less about what they wrote and a little more about how they wrote it. My name is Emily Holland, and I'm thrilled to have Mary Ardery with us tonight to celebrate her debut poetry collection, Level Watch. Mary, thank you so much for being here, for returning to the center in this way. We're so thrilled to have you.
Thank you so much. It's an honor to be here, especially since, as you said, I was a former Poet Laureate intern, so it feels kind of like coming full circle. Um, should I go ahead and start with reading a couple of poems?
Yeah, if you wouldn't mind giving us a little taste of the book, that would be wonderful to start us off.
Awesome. So the book is based on my experience working as a wilderness guide for a substance abuse program outside of Asheville, North Carolina, in the Blue Ridge Mountains. And I had one poem published with Poet Lore from the book a long time ago, and one that's actually about to come out. So I thought I would start by just reading both of those two poems. And the first one is called Snowed In at Base Camp on Valentine's Day. The group trudged up the cabin's driveway and along the winding rural road. No roses would be delivered, no chocolate truffles or ruby earrings, but we had plans to bake cookies after our walk. The brightness needled our eyes. The white went on, smooth and unbroken like the skin of a baby. Each time someone threw a snowball, it landed with a soft thunk against a puffy coat, bright red, facility issued. The newest woman made a half-hearted throw at no one. She asked if she could call her little girl who was staying with her sister until she got home. I explained policy but promised she could send a card. Someone overheard and shouted, "Don't worry, you'll learn to love the mail." Then quietly, as if confessing, she told me she knew this area. Sirens had screamed down these roads 3 times for her alone, the EMTs rushing to shock her heart back to its routine. It's hard, she said, being this close to home. Silently, she and I retraced the boot prints we'd bruised into the colorless road. The group's laughter echoed around the holler, thunk of snowballs, steady crunch of our footsteps. Outside the cabin, we stood together and watched the others make snow angels, each woman working to leave some version of herself behind. And then the second poem I'll read is called 8 Days On, 6 Days Off, which was my work schedule as a guide. And it's a double abecedarian. So the first line starts with an A and ends with an A. The second line starts with a B and ends with a B, and so forth. Altamont was the name Thomas Wolfe gave Asheville, but readers knew a book of hometown fiction's always mostly true. His novel was a backstab commercial success, and the town became a mythic destination, especially for the wealthy needing care. Zelda Fitzgerald entered treatment at Highland Hospital, in and out for 12 fraught years. 2 summers Scott visited, drunk, maybe in disbelief, gearing up for his 40th birthday at the Grove Park Inn and writing half-baked stories. It's easy to imagine his glassy gaze toward the Pisgah. I learned all this lore on a trolley ride for tourists when I joined the hippies' paradise, mountain town where you're offered a J, kind of crazy how casual on most bar patios. If you blink, little bags of white powder might appear, a summons to a bathroom stall. Maybe I was a hypocrite, judging Scott when he was at rock bottom. No way to know how he felt at the end. all the years he wouldn't be given. Oxycontin was the story I'd heard of Appalachia. I'd taken this job to prove to myself I could do meaningful work. I wanted to keep quiet tallies of how good I was. A martyrdom quest, capital M, capital Q. Reality shifts, drive the parkway alone, a self-guided tour. Some nights sloshed on South Slope, too hungover for the Alabama shakes. Ticket in my purse, but I was home dry heaving, not dancing at the concert. Ugly, I know. I told my more put together roommate it was the flu. Vomit in a bedside bowl. Really, I'm okay, as I heard the motorcycle rev. When the sun set, I drove to McDonald's, ruminating on alcohol, highbrow existentialism in a fast food booth, incessant mind-body paradox. You think working in mental health care will save you by proxy. Zelda and Scott's fates on my mind. Gone youth, gone money, gone jazz.
Thank you so much for reading those. I love hearing the poet laureate poems out loud, and also thinking of something I think we'll talk about too is the kind of longevity that you've had with this manuscript and these poems in particular as well. So you've given us so much to talk about already, which is great. Before we get into the maybe more craft focused questions, could you just tell us a little bit about who you are, and maybe how you came to poetry?
Yeah, so I was one of the kids, who just always loved stories, like wrote stories all the time as a kid. And then at some point in high school, it transitioned to poetry. And I had this wonderful high school English teacher, shout out to Mrs. Shelton, who gave us an assignment once with a packet of poems. And the only thing we had to do was write a question or two about each poem. And that just really opened up poetry for me as this place of asking questions and like the place where you don't have to have the answers. Um, so that was when I started writing poems and, gradually taking it more and more seriously as I got older, in undergrad and doing things like interning at Poet Lore as I got older. And then eventually took this job as a wilderness guide, left it to go to grad school to get an MFA. Um, Now both of those things feel kind of like a far past. They were all in the pre-COVID world, but yeah, that's kind of how the abridged version of how I got into poetry.
I love that. And I love that your entry into poetry was sort of through questioning, which I think is a really wonderful way to open oneself up to that idea of unknowing or not knowing. And I think that's what a poem can do for us, is allow us to sit with that a little bit longer as well. So um, love that. All right, so our first question for you is, since this is a conversation about the craft of writing, where does thinking about the craft of writing come into your own writing process? When are you the most aware of those more mechanical elements versus those kind of intuitive elements of the writing process?
Yeah, I think the first draft is when I'm always trying not to think about craft, just trying to write what's coming and tap into the subconscious in some way. And then it's when I come back to it, sometimes like a week later, sometimes a couple months later. I always write first drafts by hand. Um, and it's when I come back to it in a slightly different headspace when I feel like I can begin to think about craft. Um, and think about, how can I add more music into this? Or what are the images that actually matter to this poem versus what are my darlings? And I think occasionally though you have the rare poem. Like there's maybe two poems in this book that kind of arrived fully formed, but they were ones that I wrote, I think, later in the process when I'd been immersed in laboring over so many of the other poems that occasionally, if you're working really hard, you might get, that one poem every few years that kind of appears. So those are always a gift. But I think it's not that you're not thinking about craft, it's that you've just been doing it all on the other poems and then suddenly it
Yeah.
appears um, in one poem.
Yeah, that's really interesting to think about how the sort of mental work or the work that you're doing elsewhere can impact the new thing as well. Or oftentimes, like you might already be sort of writing the poem even off the page, right? You're thinking about it or sort of ruminating on these things, and then it is a wonderful gift when it arrives and you're like, oh, it sort of doesn't need that much in terms of extra additional help right now. Um,
Yeah,
but very rare, at least in my experience.
very rare.
You mentioned things like music and image, and we talked briefly before we let everyone else in about the poet Gregory Orr and his four temperaments and things like that. And so I wanted to kind of start with this question, which forgive the sort of long lead up to this question, but in an interview, Gregory Orr said, places can be beloved. And he says, we can enter into a relationship that's deep and reciprocal and sustaining, where we give to the place and the place gives to us. And this collection is really grounded in place in many ways. And it's also grounded in this idea of the beloved in terms of place, but also these different people. So I was really thinking about this quote and place in particular. And I wondered if you could talk a little bit about how place might function as its own kind of form or formal constraint in the collection, how it might have impacted the way you're able to put these poems to the page.
Yeah, yes, so many shout outs to Greg Orr for his thinking on poetry. I so when I took this job and moved to Asheville, North Carolina, I had never before visited Western North Carolina, and so the beauty of it just it stunned me. Like I felt in awe of it and the new trees I was encountering,
Mm.
like rhododendron. There's a lot of rhododendron in this book. And for those of you who maybe aren't familiar with rhododendron, they have these really waxy, opaque leaves. Um, they almost look fake, like something you'd see at Hobby Lobby. And when you walk through a rhododendron tunnel, it can suddenly become dark and it's the middle of the day. And so I was having this experience on one hand of this awe of this place, but then I also was new to the wilderness, to wilderness expeditions, and I also had a lot of fear because it's intimidating, and I was in charge of keeping a group of people safe. Um, and so what happens if, there's terrible weather or you encounter a bear? And I think the book for me at some point became kind of oscillating between these two intense feelings of awe and fear. Um, and to me, that felt really ripe for poetry. Like we were talking about with uncertainty, like how can you hold space for both of those things? Um, and I think I have some poems that lean into the awe and the beauty, and some poems that lean into the fear. And the poems that I always feel, most proud of are the ones that are ideally holding both of those.
Mm.
And that's sort of the formal constraint that I'm always hoping to reach and sometimes can.
Thank you. I'm also really interested in this place in particular, right? Not just Asheville, but all of Appalachia and the sort of beauties and contradictions that it holds, especially in the minds of people who haven't been there or haven't lived there. So I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit about balancing that kind of knowledge of a place alongside reader expectations or perceptions, right, which are sometimes incorrect, and how you might complicate assumptions about a place and its people, and what it's like.
Yeah. I think one way is to, of course, tell a variety of stories and try and, contain the multitude of people's experiences. I think another thing that I was trying to do in the book was convey the speaker's expectations in that way too. Like in the 8 days on, 6 days off poem that I read, there's a line, something like Oxycontin was the story I'd been told of Appalachia. And, I moved to North Carolina from Indiana, and that was one of the things I knew about North Carolina. But of course, or Appalachia as a region, of course, it's not the only thing. But I think leaning into being honest about your own sort of maybe preconceived expectations or stereotypes can be a gentle way to invite readers to do the same and maybe consider what stories they've been told,
Mm.
and but hopefully not in a didactic way of like you should reconsider, but just give an example of here's something I've reconsidered.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah, it's almost like the impulse to have like a perfect speaker isn't always the right impulse, right? Sometimes we need the speaker to kind of be implicated on the page and to be complicated in order to reveal something. And I think that's very present here in a lot of different ways, right? The way that the speaker moves through the experiences in the wilderness with these women, but then also their own experiences and sort of sometimes mirrored, sometimes not. Um, and those levels of complication that open up these different windows for the reader to come in.
Absolutely.
All right, let me just get back to my questions. And just a reminder to folks, if you have questions, just pop them into the chat as they come to you. I will take a look as they come, and hopefully ask them. Um, I'm also thinking about how setting and place connect to the narrative nature of so many of these poems. I think someone, as you were reading, mentioned earlier being very immersed in the scene that was happening. And I felt the same way when I was reading the book and kind of moving through all the poems in the sequence and things like that. So can you talk about maybe your narrative impulse on the page and how do you kind of use the poem to tell a story, and kind of strike that balance between the narrative elements, but also those more lyric or kind of poetic elements that we know and love?
Yeah, it is for whatever reason my it's always been my sort of natural mode. Um, and I think one of the things I've tried to do more as I've worked on my poems is, I guess, describe more and tap into all those five senses and describe more than explain, which I guess is just another way of saying the old adage of show, don't tell. Um, but I think that as humans, we're so hardwired to find narrative and create narrative that I remember at one point reading, I can't remember what poem it was, but it was this very imagistic poem. And I remember realizing I was creating so much narrative just from these images that, like, if you're just given the image like a broken glass window and blood on the carpet, like those two images, you're automatically spinning a narrative about what has happened. And so I realized that one way I could sort of strengthen my narrative was really focus on images, and images, interpreted broadly, like the five senses, not just visual.
Mm.
Um, and that was it didn't always have to be like a play-by-play scene, um, if that makes sense.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think that's something that, at least for me, is always kind of the struggle, right? That balancing act of the image and how the image becomes kind of that pivot point between one thing and then that meaning that you can kind of interpret. Um, but I think that you're walking that tightrope very well in this, right? Because we have all these images that pulled together, and then there's some gaps, right, in certain elements of the narrative that we might circle back to, or we might re-see later. Some recursiveness that happens across the poems as well, that almost acts as like a prism for us to kind of see something from a new angle, which is really kind of the fun part of moving through a whole collection that's pretty unified in terms of its content and themes too.
Yeah, I love that idea of the prism and seeing things through it in a different light.
Yeah, I wondered, I see a question in the chat that I really do want to get to, but while we're talking about sort of the book as a whole, I wondered if you could talk a little bit about how you structured the book, how you moved through kind of organizing these poems, which I think might lead us into Chelsea's question afterwards. So yeah, maybe just kind of a little bit about the manuscript's journey, and how you have worked with it and through it, to your path to publication.
Yeah. So as far as sort of revising the book as a whole, one of the intensities of my job was that you'd work 1 week on, 1 week off, and those weeks could be really dissonant. Like 1 week,
Mhm.
you might be paired with an amazing co-guide and perfect. Then the very next week, you might be paired with somebody brand new to the woods, and the group is fighting a lot, and it rains every day. And so the experience of the job could sometimes be really jarring. And when I was writing the book, or I guess more so revising it, I wanted to smooth that out for the reader and have a little bit more of a linear
Mm.
growth or progression through the book. So I tried to tie that into the seasons. And so sometimes what that looked like was when I was placing the poems, I realized, oh, this poem takes place in winter, but to fit the emotional trajectory of the book, I should actually probably revise it and make it take place in spring.
Mm.
So there were things like that where the book really lives in this space between fact and fiction. And I think that was something I hadn't expected when I started writing it. I thought it would be more like a memoir in poems, but now
Mm.
I don't call it that at all because I have revised so much, and not always, strictly aligned with reality in that regard. Um, so revising the book as a whole was definitely very seasonal based in a way
Mm.
that I think at first kind of felt like a limitation, but ultimately gave me an anchor or kind of like a creative constraint. Um, that helped me have this like year-long seasonal
Mm.
framework to work with it.
Yeah, I love what you say about revising away from maybe like that literal truth of the poem, right? Because sometimes, especially when we're writing like an early draft or when we're kind of early poets, we can be so beholden to the literal that we don't always realize that the larger kind of view of the collection, or maybe how the poem is reacting to other poems, it needs to be edited in a way that's maybe away from that literal truth, but more towards that kind of emotional truth you can gain. So how did you sort of give yourself that permission or that freedom to do that? Because it can be very hard to kind of let go of some of that.
Yeah, some of it was that I made the decision to not really consult my journals from
Mm.
that time because And I think I did at the very end, like kind of go back for just some gritty details, like sensory things. But when I was writing most of the manuscript, I didn't want to read my old journals because I thought I would get too wed to this is
Mm.
exactly what happened. Um, and another thing was that my advisor, Judy Jordan, she has an MFA in poetry and an MFA in fiction. And I am not a fiction writer, but she is somebody who really has a strength, I think, in helping poetry collections have a narrative arc.
Mm.
Um, and so she was one of the ones who kept reminding me, like, something like this could happen in the poem. It doesn't have to have happened in real life, or um, just trying to, she was good about reminding me to get more external danger and conflict in the poems because sometimes I can live a little bit in my head, but she was always encouraging me to have those sort of visceral threats about the rivers rising
Mm.
and things like that, that fiction writers are really good at. And sometimes as poets, that's not my natural instinct to have all the external conflict.
Yeah. Yeah, I love that. Sometimes it is interesting too to have an advisor or a reader who is kind of on a different has different interests than you on the page, right? They can see things that maybe you're not seeing or help you see what the poem might need outside of your original habits too. So maybe we all need a fiction writer to to read through our poems.
Yeah. God bless the fiction writers because I'm not one of them, but I'm very grateful to them.
All right, we have some really good questions in the chat, so I'm going to go to there. We'll start with Chelsea's question, which is, was there any poem that was particularly difficult to write, but you knew was important for the collection? How did you approach writing that one poem, or maybe there were a few poems like that?
Yeah. Also, hi, Chelsea. I met Chelsea at a writing workshop in May a little bit ago. Um, so one of the ones that comes to mind is the one I was just kind of mentioning about like the rivers rising. It's this poem called Waterproof,
Hmm.
and it's a poem about a really, really wet week where the rivers did rise so much and it felt dangerous to cross them and feeling a little bit like, okay, where do we go from here if we don't feel safe crossing these rivers anymore? Um, and I don't know why I had such a hard time writing it. I think it was I wanted it to be this sort of really sensory oriented poem, like immersive in that sense. Um, but it was one that I just labored over a lot and I could never quite figure out how I wanted it to end. And actually, Sarah Arnold, who might be here, she's my editor at June Road. Um, she was the one who suggested the final ending. It ends on a question like, "Are we lost?" Which is a repeated question that comes earlier in the poem too. Um, and this poem felt important to me to keep though because it did have that threat or like I was talking about earlier, like the fear of the wilderness and the real potential for danger when you're out in the backcountry. So I wanted to keep the poem, and I guess the simplified answer to Chelsea's question is I approached writing it just by laboring over it, but it got to the finished point with help from outside people.
Mm. Wonderful. Thank you. Thank you for that question too. Before I get to other folks' questions, I also had a question about the title of the collection and what I want to say I think was the former title when I saw the collection earlier, which is a title of a poem. They're not lying when they tell you you'll dream of the dead. And I'm really interested in titles in general. So I wondered if you could talk about the manuscript's former title, the weight that that puts on perhaps a title poem in a sense, and how you arrived at Level Watch as now the title of the collection.
Yeah, so you're right that the collection did used to be titled "They're Not Lying When They Tell You You'll Dream of the Dead." And that title is a dream poem. And there's a series of dream poems in the book that have variations of
Hmm.
that title. Um, and I think I originally titled it the collection that because for me, this book originated from an elegiac place, and those dream poems are elegies for somebody who's died. Um, and I think I left it as the title for so long because I kind of had this, because it originated as an elegy, the book, I couldn't quite like outgrow my perception of it as that, even
Hmm.
though the book actually became like, yes, it's part elegy, but it's also, I hope, a rigorous examination of the speaker, and the speaker's story, just as much as it is an elegy for other people. Um, and so it was hard for me to let go of that title because it just was what I'd had in my mind as the book for so long. Um, but one of the reasons we landed on level watch is because it is a clinical term in the book that's used. Um, so there's this element of when you encounter the book and you just see the title, you don't know what it means.
Hmm.
But personally, I love that as a reader experiencing reading a book and having a moment of, oh, that's the title. Like I have this moment of recognition.
Hmm.
Um, but before you do encounter that and know what it means, my hope is that it kind of connotes the title with the cover like a fire watch or
Hmm.
like a sense of keeping watch, being vigilant, and positions me and the speaker as somebody who's kind of witnessing um, a lot of things going on. So that's how we ended on level watch, but it was a long road to get there. We had so many ideas in a brainstorming document for like at least a month that we were tossing around. So for anyone out there struggling with your collection's title, I feel you because that was emotionally difficult to choose just
It is,
one.
it is so hard, right? Because as you're working towards a collection, you have an idea of the thing, right? What you're working with. And as it changes and you change and all these different things are sort of swirling around it, there's almost like, well, the one thing that you can really control is maybe that title or the shape of the thing. Um, so yeah, I can imagine it um, being very difficult to move away from that. But I think Level Watch is doing that work that you were talking about, right? Where when you encounter the book and you're moving through the poems, you're like, okay, I'm seeing some relation here. And then when you encounter the term within the poems, then it's sort of that like, oh, now it's all falling into place, which I really love as well. So um, I think all of the hard work was worth it to get there.
Thank you. All of the
Um,
emotional toil.
so Trevo has a question. Do you have a structured revision process? What areas of the poem do you zero in on when revising?
That's a good question. I wish I had a structured revision process. I think for me, it's usually coming back to a poem after some time away. And because I do tend to just naturally have a narrative bent, really focusing on where I can add more music of some kind, assonance or repetition of words or even entire phrases and lines, or imagination, like bringing in similes and metaphors and thinking about what words and worlds and textures that you want to sort of import into your poem. So those are things, the music and the imagination, those are things that I almost always do on revision. Those are things that do not really come naturally to me on a first draft. Um, I'm writing a simile and then deciding it's a bad simile and trying to write five more for one line. Those are the things that I really kind of labor over um, in revision. But but yeah, I wouldn't say it's structured. It's messy, but in a way that ends in a like it feels cohesive at the end is how I kind of know I've reached the
Mm.
end.
Yeah, sometimes we have to make a more of a mess in order to get to that kind of fully realized poem at the end too. So I definitely agree with that kind of messiness that comes with revision too.
And I think that's something that took me a long time to learn. Like I was afraid to get messy at first because again, Greg Orr talks about writers and just people in general having different thresholds for chaos.
Mm.
And I come to writing as somebody who has identifies as having a low threshold for chaos. And I come to writing trying to have less chaos, and create less chaos in my headscape. Um, and so it took me a while to accept that like, oh, it's okay to have like a super messy draft, or maybe you do just like list out all the similes like off to the side and it gets really ugly before it gets to a place that feels
Mm.
finished.
Thank you. These are great questions from everyone in the audience. So thank you for popping them in here. Emily asks, how do you ensure that your poems will resonate emotionally with the reader or audience? Or do you focus on emotions without considering the reader or audience?
Hmm. I think I probably focus more on my emotions since that's the only thing I can, access fully. Um, One of the things I've been doing recently is I record myself reading my poems out loud, not just to listen back to them, but because just the act of recording itself for me functions as like the illusion of having an audience.
Mm.
And so I find that when I hit that record button, I just have this kind of like heightened awareness of my poem, as if I'm reading it to a crowd. Um, and that kind of helps me tap into some of my emotions or how I might anticipate other people might receive it since I'm imagining an audience.
Mm.
Um, but yeah, I think I first focus on my emotions as I'm writing before thinking about that audience, whether real or imagined.
Yeah, that's really interesting. We always say read your poems out loud, especially, as you're writing and revising, but I've never thought to record. And as you were saying that, I could feel myself getting kind of like squeamish, like, oh, because there is that kind of not necessarily finality, but that implication that then it could be listened back by you or, by someone else that is really interesting and complicated. So maybe I'll have to start doing that. Um,
Yeah, I think it's helpful.
yeah. I love that. Um, all right, let me get to more of these questions. Hajer is wondering, were there poems that you had to remove entirely or been requested to remove because they did not fit with the collection? How do you make those decisions? Maybe sometimes as tricky as that title change decision can be too, right? They say sometimes I write something that I really love, but it feels like an outsider to the collection. And yeah, it's definitely painful to have to cut something out that you love. So thank you for the question.
Yeah, that is a good question. One version of this manuscript ended with a kind of epilogue poem that was like a pretty big time jump. And I actually wrote it during my summer in DC when I was taking the metro out to Bethesda to go to the Writers Center. And I am not like a big city person, so riding the metro was just kind of this. I just felt so alive, but also very aware of my mortality every time I took those escalators all the way, way, way down. And so I had this poem that again was an elegy. Um, and it took place very much like in the city. And for a while, that was the ending to the book. Um, And I think I can't remember if people told me, like if an editor told me it didn't fit or if I came to that on my own, but eventually I accepted that like I like this poem, but this is such a place-based book that it didn't really make sense or feel like the most grounded way to end the book by just
Mm.
jumping to a totally new place that hasn't been referenced throughout the entire book. So that felt a little bit like a darling I had to cut. Um, but I recently was at a festival, um, and I heard Dana Smith read, and they were saying how they have poems that have never made it into any of their collections, but they're always in the manuscript process, and they consider
Mm.
them bay leaf poems because they give it flavor but don't make it into the final version of the book. And I just thought that was so helpful to think about.
Mm.
Um, because I already know I have a few sort of like pillar poems that are kind of like my obsessions, that um, might not make it into books, but they always feel kind of crucial to what I'm trying to write
Mhm.
about. And maybe you can write around them, but then take them out. And maybe they will make it into a collection one day. But it's also okay if they're bay leaf poems.
Mm. I love that. It makes me think about how, right, like what you just said, sometimes we need to write something in order to write the other things that maybe will remain in the collection. I love that metaphor, bay leaf poems. That's a really
Yeah.
great way to think about it. And we could sprinkle as many as we want in there to flavor that collection and then
Yeah.
just pull them out later. So that's
Yeah.
wonderful. Thank you for sharing. Okay. These are great questions. Okay, Liz is wondering about the stories of the women in recovery that are included in the collection. Um, how do you choose what details or narratives to include or exclude? And I think, I also had a similar thought as well about, the kind of complications and ethics that comes into writing about other people. We all do it. That's sort of the task of being a writer. So yeah, maybe how do you like negotiate those choices and inclusions in the story? Because there are some really great kind of voices and things that come in that I think are really pivotal to how we see and then re-see the speaker's journey.
Yeah. And so one thing I'll also say is of course everything in the book is anonymized or generalized and sometimes um they're just full on composite characters,
Mm.
meaning, not based on a specific person. Um which again, my advisor with the fiction writing background is very helpful in that regard. Um a lot of the narratives that I chose to include um are ones that felt, I guess, kind of representative to me of the experience. Um, but also I wasn't necessarily thinking about like, oh, I need to include this person's narrative or this
Mm.
person's narrative. Some of it was more intuitive, I would say, functioning at that level. Um, and it is still hard. Like I've talked about, I feel like what's in this book feels kind of like 1% of my experience with this job. And so sometimes I have this fear that like the book is going to replace the reality in my memory.
Mm.
Um, but yeah, which details or narratives to include or exclude. I think I also didn't I just wanted to be very intentional about not like exploiting or sensationalizing details or narratives. So, there are some narratives I heard that probably would feel a little sensational if I'd included them in the book. Um, and so I did not choose to include those um, as part of the collection.
Thank you. Yeah, I think it's always something that is important to ask ourselves, right? All of us as writers are not necessarily just telling our story. There's so many people that we're interacting with that come into our stories, and how we choose to put those stories to the page can be really impactful. And I think that there is such a level of care and attention to all of the stories in this manuscript that I found really profound. And regardless, if it's a composite character, that's great, but on the page, these characters still feel real, right? And I think that's, again, the benefit of some of that editing that you were talking about, maybe leaning more towards those fiction impulses that still maybe even make things a little bit more concrete on the page in a way that the literal reality might not have allowed you to do. So yeah, thank you for touching on that too. Right, so many good questions. This is so great. All right, Sassy has a question a little bit more kind of expansive about the fiction elements. So during revision, are there prompts, exercises, practices that are helpful for maybe enabling poets to be more descriptive once you have maybe like the bones or the skeleton of the draft? Or do you have maybe like tips and tricks for loosening our grip on those literal truths?
Yeah. Sometimes what I challenge myself to do is if I have a poem that I feel like is just kind of feeling too much like prose, I make myself include a sensory detail or a simile or metaphor in every line.
Hmm.
And usually it's, too much. But I find that kind of helps me swing the pendulum in the opposite direction. And then I can kind of scale it back and find what's the right amount of sensory detail and imaginative language to actually have in the poem. Um, that's something like my go-to one to just kind of overdo it in that regard and then scale back. Um, but then other things are just before you decide on like a simile or a metaphor, to just force yourself to make a list of possibilities. Um, because I know I can get lazy and just be like, okay, I thought of a simile, great. Like I can check the simile box. But sometimes your fifth idea is going to be the more interesting one that nobody else has thought of yet. Um, so just kind of forcing yourself to give yourself more options before landing on one.
Great, thank you. It reminds me of, I think it was Melissa Febos who has an exercise that's like rewriting the same scene, but you can't use any of the same details like as you keep rewriting. And that your simile idea seems similar, right? Like redoing the simile, but maybe complicating it or making it different, or surprising yourself more and more each time. Not just landing on that easy answer or that easy description, um,
Uh,
which is easy
I'm
to
gonna use
do.
that one now.
All right. So Paul has a question about sort of the we behind the book. And I'd love to talk a little bit, maybe this can get to Allison's question too, just about your path to publication. Um, Allison's question was, how long did you work on the manuscript before it felt ready? And then if you would talk about your experience with June Road Press, an independent press, which was very vital to our literary ecosystem. Um, so yeah, maybe we can combine those two questions into one sort of path to publishing, how long you've worked on it and your experience there.
Yeah, I would say it. I actively was writing the book for about 3 years, and then tinkering with it a little while sending it out. Um, and then I submitted it for 5 years. And Emily, I know your book that recently was accepted, also you submitted for about 5 years, right?
Yeah.
So it's a long 5 years. Um, and then to talk a little bit about June Road. So when my book was accepted, Sarah Arnold, who is a one-woman operation who runs June Road, we did a pretty intensive round of revisions, like maybe a month back and forth with, I think she left me something like 1,000 comments in a Google Doc. And that was pretty overwhelming because at that point, I kind of hadn't touched the manuscript in a couple years because I had been sending it out for so long. And it was intimidating to go back into it with a revision mindset after all this time. But it was so helpful. And I I know some presses have that editorial mindset and some are more like we're accepting the book and we love it as is and we're just putting it out. But I'm really grateful to Sarah for this because this is my first book and she really helped me with especially seeing like the threads between poems and like having an outsider's eyes look at it with such depth and such care. I feel like really unified the collection, bringing out themes like fire sounds like kind of an obvious one because we're in the woods and building fires, but I feel like using fire in a more metaphorical way throughout the collection and in some of the titles of the poems, things like that just really unified the book, I think. And um, yeah, working with June Road is very collaborative. Like we came up with the title together, and um, I had a lot of say in the cover, which again, I'm very grateful for. Um, yeah, I feel really lucky to have landed with a press like this after sending it out for so long, um, because you don't always know what you're walking into uh,
Yeah.
with some presses. So
Yeah, right. And 5 years of consistently sending it out and not just sending it out, but paying submission fees, waiting, getting on finalist lists, right? All those things that keep you going, but also um, can make you feel like you're just kind of like on the hamster wheel and never getting off. Um, but yeah, I'm very glad that it has made it out into the world, knowing your consistent journey. Um, and I think too, right, what you said about going back to the book after having submitted it for so long, it does almost feel like it's unfamiliar at that point. Because at least for me as well, I wasn't touching it while I was sending it out. And so just recently I was like, I probably should reread it on my own, right? Just to like touch base with it again and sort of get back into that mind space after not being in it for so long. So um, yeah, it's a very weird thing that we do, right? This submitting and publishing, but there is a beauty at the end of it too.
absolutely.
Oh, right, let me just do a quick time check. Okay, we've got some time for some of these questions. Allison had another question. At what point in your writing process do you share a poem for feedback? I think that's a really great question.
That is a good question. I think I used to share my poems earlier, sometimes probably prematurely when I hadn't quite figured out the heart of them. Um, I don't share my poems even as much as I used to. I still, of course, do have a few trusted readers, but I usually wait longer to send it to them until like maybe 6 months, and like then I have gone back to it, and so then I feel kind of like a new reader to it. And then once I've kind of the future version of myself has given feedback on it, then I send it out for feedback to those trusted readers. Um, but the caveat to that would be some of my trusted readers are also just, my close friends. So sometimes you send a first draft to somebody just because you want that endorphin rush of, hey, I created something and I want to share it with you. But like, I don't want feedback yet, except for like, great job, keep it up. So that version isn't for feedback, but I guess I just think that's worth sharing because it's just nice to create things in community with people.
Mhm.
So I'm pretty explicit about if I'm asking for feedback or not, or if I just want encouragement.
Yeah. Yeah. No, I think that's great. And I think it is so necessary, right? Because we do feel while we're writing, we can feel like we're doing this thing on our own. And maybe you're not ready to share for feedback, or maybe you don't necessarily need feedback at that stage, but you still don't want to feel like it's just you and your notebook or your Word document. So yeah, I always love a little, hey, I just wrote this. Nice things only, right? Don't start nitpicking yet. Um, but it is important to have different people who can provide all of that different type of support or feedback whenever you need it too.
Yeah.
Okay, all right. Well, we are just sadly arriving at the end of our hour. So, Mary, I think I'll turn to our kind of final question, um, which is broad. What is your go-to craft advice? Maybe something for yourself or for writers in the audience. What would you advise in terms of craft?
Yeah. I mean, of course, read widely. I feel like I just have to say that almost like a liability. I don't know. But I think the biggest thing that's been helpful for me is to try and identify what I see as my strength in poetry and what I see as maybe not my weakness, but what I just don't tend to do naturally, and focus on both of those. Like focus on improving what you already have as your strength so that you can like just get better and better and better. But also like so that for me, I think that would be more like narrative. What I naturally do, I want to just do as well as I can, do as well as anyone can. Um, and then what does not come naturally to me at all is music. So I guess the craft advice is more like self-awareness and using that to build your own craft lessons or curriculum.
I love that. I love a DIY craft curriculum, but I think that's a beautiful way to end, right? Sort of know yourself, know your strengths, know your weaknesses, and work on both. Don't ignore either side of that coin, too. Wonderful. Well, thank you so much, Mary, for coming back to Poet Lore, coming back virtually to the Poet Lore office where we once spent so much time together. Please, 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 everyone, if you don't have a copy of Level Watch already, buy a copy, request it for your library, write reviews, post about it. You will definitely want to read the whole collection after hearing some of those poems today. So Mary, thank you for your time, your generosity, and everyone in the audience, thank you for spending an hour with us talking about poetry, and thank you for your wonderful questions as well. It was a really great chat tonight.
Thank you all, and thank you so much, Emily.